Vice-Chancellor Craig Lednell. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. I'm really pleased to be here, although it is difficult to speak to a motion such as this. Should Britain leave the EU? I would have thought for any right-minded person the answer was absolutely clear and obvious, and the answer is yes, and as quickly as possible, because it's a disaster. It's a disaster. And I don't think Britain should just leave. I think Greece should leave. I think France should leave. I think Germany should. They should all leave. Because I want to try and just disabuse you of one thing. If any of you come on tonight and expected to hear me give an anti-European rant, then you're in for a very major disappointment. I'm married to a German. I worked in the city for 2 French companies. Okay, they both sacked me, but I tried not to. I've drunk more Rioja than most people alive and standing up in Britain today, and I love Europe. I love Europe. It is the most incredible, fantastic continent on earth. You drive 100 miles across Europe, you find different people, different languages, different cheese, different wine. It is the most incredible, diverse cultural place. You know, drive 1,000 miles across the Midwest of America, cross Australia, and you find a monoculture. Europe has got something that is really wonderful and really special. And sadly, all these individual nation states are handed over their democracy, handed over their independence to a bunch of incompetent crooks based in Brussels at the European Commission, headed up by somebody who I did my bit to try and make famous, a man called Herman Van Rompuy, or Rumpy Pumpy, as he's better known in the Sun. And the idea that these people represent something called Europe is a nonsense. So let's just begin there. Europe, the European Union, 2 completely different things. Now look, we need to understand why we have this European Union, why we are where we are, why it began. In the space of 31 years, we had these 2 absolutely horrific world wars. You know, the First World War, a ghastly military conflict. The Second World War, a global war in every sense, but of course with implications for civilians, through bombing, with the deliberate attempt to wipe out races of people in the Holocaust. I mean, genuinely awful, awful things. And it's not surprising that after the war, people said, we've got to try and stop this sort of thing from happening again. I mean, quite right. Of course we've got to try and stop this sort of thing from happening again. But their analysis was that the existence of nation states had led to war, and therefore the answer was very simple. We abolish nation state and there'll be no more war ever after. Well, it's a lovely idea. It's in fact a very similar idea to communism, because communism was a great idea on paper, wasn't it? I mean, Karl Marx's idea that we make the world a better and fairer place, who could possibly argue against that? Perhaps there are 1 or 2 Marxists in the audience, I don't know. We'll find out during Q&A. Well, we'll find out during Q&A. But I mean, the trouble with Marxism was, as it was applied in Soviet Russia, that those people that got rid of the Tsar, those people that took part in the revolution, none of them thought when they were doing it, they would usher in a regime that would ultimately kill 40 million of its own people and leave Russia even more divided and even poorer than it was before. So the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. And I think they got this wrong, because actually, if you have democracies in Europe, mature democracies in Europe, they don't go to war with each other. You know, had the Weimar Republic held as a democracy, we would not have had World War II. Of that I'm convinced. So what we should have been doing, post-1945, is to make sure that democracy, cooperation and trade flourish. It's very interesting. When countries trade together and do lots of business together, they don't tend to fight each other. But no, we decided that we've got to form a new state, a United States of Europe, and that of course is why there's a flag and an anthem and they're building a European army and police force, they're building a state. They seem to have completely blinded themselves to the fact that we tried this once before in Europe, just 25 years earlier. Because after the Treaty of Versailles, when we sort of decided what we were going to make the Germans do and pay for, the problem of the Balkans really exercised Woodrow Wilson, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and they thought that we really can't have all these ridiculous little Balkan countries, all these Serbs and Croats and Herzegovinans and Bosnians, all these different states in the Balkans. They're forever having punch-ups, going around shooting archdukes, causing a vast amount of trouble. They said, we know what we'll do. We'll make it one country. We'll give them one flag. We'll give them one anthem, one leader, one police force, one army. We'll call it Yugoslavia, and by getting rid of all those individual nationalities, we'll guarantee peace. Well, within your lifetimes, we have seen the worst atrocities being committed in Europe as people have fought and done dreadful things to get back the independence and self-government and national self-determination of their own nations. And this really, folks, is my point. That's the biggest point I want to make to you tonight. You cannot have a federal, central, United States of Europe without the consent of the people. And that consent has never been given. Your parents, or perhaps grandparents, had a referendum on this way back in 1975, which to most of you seems like ancient history, I know. And even I wasn't old enough, believe me, to vote in that referendum. But I remember my mum and dad both voted for us being staying part, in fact, of a common market. So the idea was we could trade with our European neighbours without having heavy tariff burdens. The idea was that because our trade would grow, cooperation and friendship would grow. I mean, it seemed on the face of it a sensible thing to vote for. Nobody in this country voted for a political union that now makes 75% of our laws. And indeed, this problem is manifest across the whole of Europe. Think of the euro, if you can bear to look at the continuing agony, the slow-motion car crash that the euro represents. Only 2 countries in Europe had a referendum on joining the euro. Sweden and Denmark. And guess what they both said? They both said no. The French, in 2005, had a referendum on the European Constitution. And I just so wished I'd tried harder at French at school. Well, there I was in the final no rally, addressing 7,000 French people in this room. But when I said dites le non, they all sort of cheered and clapped. I just kept on saying it, and that was my contribution. But the French said no in a referendum to a European constitution. 3 days later, the Dutch, by a massive majority, said no to the European constitution. And what do? These people that now attempt to run this continent. What they did was they rebranded it as the Lisbon Treaty and boasted that because it was now called a treaty and not a constitution, it would not need to be put to referendums. Isn't that wonderful? And I led a series of protests in the European Parliament about this. I think at one point they were fining me more than my salary was actually, but never mind. That's never worried me too much. But one country had to have a referendum on it, even though it was a treaty, and that country was Ireland. And Ireland said no. But that wasn't good enough. The Irish were told, you've made a terrible mistake, and you've got to vote again. And indeed, in the second Irish referendum, they used huge amounts of taxpayers' money in a completely lopsided, one-sided referendum to get the result they deserved. Some will tell you, I mean, if a Tory came to speak to you, Damien Green or whoever it may be, although I can't really tell whether he's Tory, but actually, I can't tell any of them apart. I mean, they look the same, they sound the same, and on issues of major international importance and national importance, you frankly can't put a cigarette paper between them. You know, they're all the same people. Clegg, Cameron, the millipede as I call them, and they're all the same. They all come from the most incredibly privileged backgrounds. They all go to Oxbridge, and they all leave Oxbridge and become researchers. And then they become politicians. Not one of them has served in the army. Not one of them has risen up through the ranks of a trade union. Not one of them, as I did, has been to a bank to borrow money to set up a business. It's a scary, big thing in your life to go out there and do. None of them have got any connection with the real world. And whilst I'm far from perfect, I always say that I've got at least 20 years of experience in business before coming into this, and I spent 20 years working in the city, and I worked damn hard up until lunchtime every single day. So there's nothing to choose between them. They all believe we should be part of the European Union. They all think that having 75% of our laws made somewhere else is fine. They all think that a membership fee of £51 million a day to a club whose accounts have not been signed by the auditors for 17 years in a row is fine and dandy. And they all think that because of EU targets, we must despoil our entire nation and our seascape with windmills that are ugly, useless, and actually increase overall the amount of CO2 emissions. You know, we have a career political class. So if you challenge them on these democratic problems, on these questions of consent that I'm discussing with you tonight, they will all say, well, of course, we've got to reform the European Union. There is a deficit. There is a democratic deficit in the European Union, and we're going to amend it and bend it and shape it and make it better. We're not. This EU isn't undemocratic, it's anti-democratic. They actually hate democracy. Monnet, who was the father of this, was the super bureaucrat. And he was of the view, as so many of the new aristocracy, remember what the French did? They guillotined all the aristocracy and then replaced them with a new aristocracy, and those same families, who all go to the same university, are still running France. And they have a view that the ordinary peasantry really aren't fit to decide their own future, because these people know best. And what Monnet hated was the idea that a government could steer a ship in that direction for a period of 4 or 5 years, and then another government could come in and change tack. Well, this was no good to someone like Monnet, because he had big ideas, 5 and 10 and indeed 50-year plans for what should happen. So the whole thing was set up from the start with the people who've got the real power being the unelected European Commission. So when you hear about European laws, just remember this, that the people with the sole right to propose that legislation and the people with the sole right to repeal that legislation are the unelected bureaucrats in the European Commission. All that we in the Parliament can do is change the grammar ever so slightly, or perhaps delay things. In a sense, the European Parliament is rather like the House of Lords is in this country. You know, it's a check and balance, but it's no more than that. So from the start, it was set up in a fundamentally anti-democratic way. But you only need to see what's happened in the last few months in Greece and Italy to understand the type of people we're dealing with. Now, Greece is in one hell of a mess. I actually view myself as being one of the few friends the Greeks have got in the European Parliament. Because everybody is saying they must stay in the euro. And in order for Greece to stay in the euro, what we've been doing is taking a country that cannot even service the interest on its debts and lending it more money. It's rather like having a friend who's a heroin addict, isn't it? And saying, look, here's the cure, old son, here's some more heroin. It doesn't cure anything. It actually makes the patient worse. So Greece is trapped in this horrible, horrible situation. And bear in mind that for your generation, you know, post-university, Jobs are tough out there. There's a 21% youth unemployment rate in this country. But think of it in Greece and Spain, where it's now over 50%. So things are grim. Things are very, very bleak indeed. But the Greek Prime Minister, the last Greek Prime Minister, Mr. Papandreou, did something that was completely unacceptable in the eyes of our bosses in Brussels. More unacceptable, actually, than anything I've ever done, which is going some, isn't it, really? And Mr. Papandreou said, I am going to put it to a referendum, so that the people of Greece can decide whether they stay part of the Eurozone or not. And the bully boys in Brussels had him removed. An elected Prime Minister of the country that invented democracy in the first place, the Prime Minister was removed and replaced by a puppet. By somebody, this Papandreou's character, who had been the Deputy Governor of the European Central Bank, and they now have a puppet government. And Greece is now run by 3 foreign officials. An aeroplane comes in once a fortnight to Athens Airport, and out of it gets a representative of the European Central Bank, a representative of the European Commission, and a representative of the IMF, and they go and see the puppet Prime Minister and tell him what he can and can't do. The same thing happened in Italy. Now look, Mr. Berlusconi had, perhaps he was a bit past his sell-by date. He had been the Prime Minister of Italy for a very long time. He had been involved in a fair degree of scandal. I'm personally rather bitter about Berlusconi. I have to declare an interest in this. Because he didn't invite me to his leaving party, and I think it would have been rather a good do. But what do you think of Berlusconi? I think really we'd come to the point in Italy where a general election was needed, because he was losing credibility, he was becoming a clown. But oh no, my little mate Rumpy Pumpy was in Florence and stood up in Florence and said that not only must Mr. Berlusconi go, but now is not the time for elections, now is the time for action. And so they chose the new Greek Prime Minister, a man called Mario Monti, who indeed I crossed swords with on numerous occasions, a guy that was a European Commissioner for 10 years, a guy that was one of the architects of this disaster that is the Euro. And Monti is appointed to be the Prime Minister of Italy, and Mr. Monti chose his cabinet. Now, as the Vice-Chancellor said, we've had a little mini reshuffle going on in today's cabinet, but almost everybody in our cabinet, with the odd exception, you might get a retired naval commander, you might get a former successful businessman in the House of Lords, who might join a British cabinet. But 90% of them will always be elected politicians. Mr. Monti's cabinet, that now governs Italy, does not contain within it one single elected politician. So democracy, by these anti-democrats, has been stripped out in Italy and in Greece. So coming back to my point about consent, why does democracy work? I'll tell you why it works. I remember in the late 1970s when my father, who was a reasonably successful businessman, was paying an income tax rate on most of his income of 83%. 83% income tax 30 years ago. I mean, it was such a massive disincentive that what used to happen was huge numbers of your age group would leave university and just flee the country. And they did it in the 70s in huge numbers. Why bother to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go to London if you're paying 83% tax? We also had the imposition in those days of exchange controls. Now, I know that when you lot head off to Ibiza, you carry your wad of cash with you, or you've got your credit cards. But in 1979, the maximum amount of money you could take out of the country on holiday was 50 quid. Now, my father thought the government was dreadful. He was absolutely root and branch opposed to that government. But what he willed to do in a democracy is he willed to try and change the government. by supporting a different political party, by giving it money, by putting posters on the windows, by going out knocking on doors, by doing all the things that show engagement with the democratic process. And in '79, Labour went and Mrs Thatcher came in. Now, my Marxist friend and I may disagree on whether Thatcher was a good thing or a bad thing. I personally think she gave this country back a bit of pride that we'd lost, but I fully accept that if we were in Leeds at the moment, we find old mining communities that still resented her bitterly. But the point is, whether she was good or bad isn't the point I'm making. We chose her. We changed this country by the way in which we voted. And that, folks, is why democracy works. Because even if you hate the government, you've got the chance to change it. And to do so through the ballot box and through peaceable means. Now put yourselves in the minds of people of your age in Athens today. Okay? There is no democracy. It's gone. A puppet now runs the country. 3 foreign bureaucrats come in and tell the puppet what he may and may not do. General elections have now been rendered meaningless. A deflationary policy is now being imposed upon Greece that is driving her not into recession, but into depression. I don't think the British press are actually telling you how grim things in Greece are. It's not just the 50% youth unemployment rate, it's the fact that 1 in 4 families are now living what is reasonably considered to be the poverty line. It is that there are whole villages and towns where the whole high streets are boarded up and people have lost hope. People are getting desperate. But if they can't change that through the ballot box, if they have no means to be the masters of their own destiny, then all they can do is resort to civil disobedience, is resort to civil disorder. If you haven't got democracy, all you have got is civil disorder or violence or terrorism to change the future. And I really do think that if Greece is kept trapped inside this economic prison that is called the euro, there will be a revolution in Greece, maybe this year or next, and probably the army colonels will stage a coup and take the country over. And I think there's a risk that what you saw with the Arab Spring last year in North Africa, we will now see in the Mediterranean. Because the situation is the same in Portugal. It's the same in Italy. It's not dissimilar in Spain. So just as communism created the very opposite that it was intended to do, this project, designed to bring us all together, is actually sending people towards violence. And now we have German newspapers that write about Captain Schettino, you know, the guy from the Costa Concordia. German newspapers saying, well, of course, he showed himself to be a coward. All Italians are cowards. And they write about the Greeks in Bild, which is the German equivalent of the Sun. They said the Greeks are all lazy and they're all useless. And the Greek and Italian papers respond by caricatures of Angela Merkel wearing Nazi regalia. So far from peace and harmony, everybody in Europe now seems to hate each other. It's not working. The idea that we can take away democracy, the idea that we can run our economies centrally from Brussels, with the idea that one rule fits across the whole of Europe, is not going to work. So I think that we really should leave the European Union. I think we should do so amicably. It should be an amicable divorce. And we divorce ourselves from the EU. We say we no longer want to be part of your political union, but we do want to have a free trade deal with you. And recognising that we're your biggest export market in the world, recognising that the last trade balance figures for 2010 show a deficit of £49 billion, more that they sold to us than we sold to them, that shouldn't be a problem. And of course, Norway and Switzerland and even Mexico have those free trade deals without membership of the Union. So we're saying to our our EU partners at the moment. We want a different relationship based on trade. We will cooperate with you. We are very happy to operate student exchanges. We are very happy to take Polish labour, provided we know how many people are actually coming and what they're coming to do. We are very happy to sit round the table with you and talk about issues like North Sea pollution that no one country on its own can deal with. We want to have a good cooperation with you. We want to be good neighbours with you. Mind you, with the French, that'll be tricky from time to time, but never mind. You know, that's the spirit of cooperation that we must do this with. And I'll tell you what's really interesting, is that when we do that, we'll be followed in short order by Finland, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, and possibly ultimately even by Germany and maybe France itself. We will give the example to the rest of Europe that says we must break up this monstrosity. And by doing it, I think Europe will be a safer place. I think we will be a richer country, because not only will we have a trade deal with the EU, but we'll be able to negotiate our own deals with the rest of the world. We're currently forbidden from doing that. And I've often thought the Commonwealth would be a damn good place to start. They speak English, they have common law, we have a shared history. In many cases, we are kith and kin with these people. Politically, given that there are now 60% of 18 to 30-year-olds that don't vote at all, suddenly general elections will matter again. And we'll start having the kinds of debate that we had with Michael Foot on one side and Margaret Thatcher on the other. But I personally believe that the biggest benefit for us will be that we'll get back some of our own self-respect and pride. It is pitiful to see British ministers, heads of county councils, lobby groups, even up to the Prime Minister in Strasbourg the other day, going across on Eurostar, holding out a bowl and saying, please sir, can we have some of our own money back? Please don't put this new law into place. It'll close down the City of London. I mean, is this what we sunk to? That we have to go and beg at the altar of Barroso and Van Rompuy? I think it's absolutely shaming. And I think by getting out of this union, by getting back control of our destiny, by getting our country back in every sense, there will be a new national awakening, and that I think would be a very, very good thing. Folks, I've been making these arguments for nigh on 20 years. When I first started making them, my family, my colleagues at work, everyone I knew thought I was literally off my chump. You know, chap's been smoking something funny. You know, he's a complete goner. No way back for him. Because nobody really thought that this European thing posed a threat. Well, it's rather like the old Bob Monkhouse story. Bob Monkhouse said, when I was growing up, I told my family that I wanted to be a comedian, and they laughed at me. Well, they're not laughing now, are they? And it's rather like that with Euroscepticism. This is now popular, this is now in vogue, not just in Britain, but right across the continent. And a mate of mine very nearly won the Finnish general election last year on a Eurosceptic ticket. But a word of warning, we need to do this quickly. Because if we don't, in this country, get a referendum and give a lead to the rest of Europe, if it doesn't happen quickly, then my fear is that the Eurosceptic voice across Europe will not manifest itself through people like me, that are essentially libertarians and want less government and are Democrats. We risk, along with that violence that I talked about, we risk the rise of extreme nationalisms across Europe. We really, really do. And in Austria today, the Freedom Party, who are Haider's old lot, who remain completely unapologetic about the events of the 39-45 war, have now just hit 30% in the polls and are the biggest party in Austria. So I want a swift democratic solution to this. I want us to live in harmony with our European neighbours. If we do that, we'll stop extremism, we'll stop the potential violence, we'll restore democracy, and we'll feel better in ourselves for having said no to Clegg, Miliband and Cameron, and having got our own country back. Thank you very much.